German police did to him what they did to many young radicals. In those days, the appropriate thing was you do not arrest these people, you do not jail these people, you do not injure these people, and you do not kill them. That's a more modern approach. In the old days, the solution was exile. What the German police did is they came to Marx's house one day and said, "We're taking you to the train station," which they did. And they put him on a train to Paris. Remember, Europe is a continent where the countries are relatively small and close together. So it's a very few hours and you're out of Germany and you're in France. When he arrived in Paris, the French police had received a communication from the German police. They met him at the train station and said, "We know you're a troublemaker, you can't stay here. We're putting you on a train to Brussels in Belgium," which is another 2-hour train ride. And so Marx, with his wife, went there, and the Belgian police repeated this happy thing, and they sent him to London. In those years, in the middle of the 19th century, London prided itself on never ejecting political refugees. People who came not because they had committed a crime or anything like that, but they were running away for political reasons or they had been exiled. So Marx joined a very large political refugee community in London, and he spent the rest of his life, which is most of his adult life, as a citizen speaking English in London, which is where he died. And he's buried in the Highgate Cemetery in London, and there's a big monument, if you want to go see it, that's where Karl Marx is buried. He didn't have much money as a political refugee, so for part of the years he lived in London, he was a paid reporter for a New York newspaper about the time of the American Civil War, and one of the most famous and interesting things Marx wrote was a series of articles in which he analyzed the Civil War in the United States, the role of slavery in the United States, brilliant articles that were very widely read and copied here in the United States because the readership of the New York World, which was the paper that hired him, was Americans. So Marx, by the way, was quite familiar with the United States, wrote for American audiences, and so on. He's not the alien that has sometimes been presented so as to create, again, more distance between them. What Marx did was remarkable. He gave up philosophy and began to study economics. And he studied it in a way that began with his political passion. He never denied it. He never imagined it's possible to separate your passions from the work you do, including the intellectual and analytical work you do. He felt the only honest thing to do if you were an analyst was to put your passion out there so people would know that that's part of what you're doing. The idea that anybody could do it without passion would be about equivalent in Marx's eyes to anyone doing it without breathing. That's not available. You stop breathing, you're not going to be an analyst very long, and you have no passion. It's not only that you're not going to do good analysis, you're not going to do any analysis at all, because passion is part of life. We all have passions, it's just some of us are comfortable or uncomfortable with them, and some of us are honest or dishonest about them. Marx put it right out there. He didn't like capitalism. He was going to develop a critical stance towards capitalism. And that made him very different from most of the economists whose work he studied to get himself up to speed to do economic analysis. A footnote here for some of you may be interested. Unlike 99% of economists in the world, myself included, we have never taken the trouble that Marx took to write long studies of literally every major economist that had written before him. There is a 3-volume work Marx wrote that is published, available in English and many other languages, called Theories of Surplus Value. That's the title of the book. The Russian edition, because the Russians put out the most famous edition, runs 3 volumes. And all those 3 volumes are Marx's long, detailed, critical assessments of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and a whole host of the great writers before Marx, whom he studied, and you can see in what detail by reading that thing. as I say, the only other person that I know of in our profession that ever did that was a professor at Harvard years ago named Joseph Schumpeter. You may come across his name. He was very famous. He wrote a history of economic analysis. It's a book about 4 inches wide, an immense tome, but it's a testimony to that he did what Marx did. He was not a Marxist, by the way, but Marx is remarkable, and for people who are interested in how Marx came to develop his theories, he's basically done the work for us, because in those 3 volumes you can see how he worked his way. But why was he critical? Where did his passion come from? And this is important, because if you're going to understand Marxian theory, then you need to understand the passion that builds it, the passion that informs it, because that'll be part of your own assessment about your own feelings in relationship to this body of work. It's also a body of passion. He was part of a generation, born in 1818, for whom the great historical event around which their whole formation as human beings occurred was the French Revolution. Recall the dates. The French Revolution erupts in 1789. That is only 20, 30 years before Marx is born. So Marx is born into the generation that was completely mesmerized, was drawn to the drama and the passion of the French Revolution. To remind you, the slogan of the French revolutionaries who overthrew King Louis, who overthrew the rule of the feudal landlords, who overthrew the role of the Catholic Church as the biggest landlord in feudal Europe. The slogans of the revolutionaries were liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And they brought in a revolution that was to get rid of everything in society that impeded or blocked the achievement of a human community grounded on, founded on liberty, equality, and brotherhood, without distinction of race, gender, or anything else. And Marx was absolutely caught up, as most of the young people of his generation were, with the nobility and the beauty of that image. The interesting thing was that the French Revolution also got rid of feudalism. It took the land away from the feudal landlords. It took the land and the buildings away from the Roman Catholic Church. It dispossessed the 2 great power institutions of feudalism, the landed nobility and the church. Instead, everybody became a buyer and a seller in the market. The powerful became the people who could amass moneyed wealth, not the people who were born into a noble family, not the people who grew up within the church hierarchy. Those people were actually marginalized or eliminated altogether. So the French Revolution was 2 things, if you think about it. On the one hand, the end of the feudal economic system and the emergence into dominance, to this day, of capitalism. But it was a transition from feudalism to capitalism that was wrapped in a noble, passionate commitment. And the best way to say it is this way. Feudalism has to give way to capitalism, the champions of capitalism said, because that's the way to bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. We didn't have it under feudalism. If we get rid of those institutions, the feudal institutions, if we replace it with capitalism, where everybody has an equal chance to make money, build an enterprise, work for whoever is the best payer, each of us struggling, we can have a society of equally people where our rewards are proportionate to the effort we put out there. All of this kind of talk can be summarized in the view, the passionate view, that it's worthwhile to have, which it was, a violent revolution to bring modern France into existence. And remember, what was the country that copied the French Revolution? The United States. Copied it in the sense of copying the writings of Rousseau and the writings that led to the French Revolution, even though it happened a little bit later, but it was the same inspiration as the American Revolution. Both of these were violent events that were justified in the violent overthrow in the case of France, of the old feudal regime, in the case of the United States, of the backward old royal regime of King George in England. The rationale, the justification, liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's why Thomas Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, etc. The same language, the same imagery as you had in the one place as the other. Capitalism would bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The promise of the American Revolution in the 1770s, the promise of the French Revolution in the 1780s. Now here comes the punchline. By 1818, which is 30 years later, Marx, who is as wonderfully in love with the image of liberty, equality, and fraternity as anybody ever was, believed in it all his life. He, however, reached a very important conclusion. Yes, the American, French, and other revolutions had successfully overthrown feudalism and brought in capitalism. But, and here comes the punchline, the promise that the transition to capitalism would also usher in liberty, equality, and fraternity had, in Marx's view, been broken. That promise was broken. Those things were not accompanying capitalism. On the contrary, as Marx looked around the exploding industrial capitalism of England and France and Germany in his lifetime, it was populated by super rich capitalists at one end and a mass of desperately poor workers coming in off the countryside, living in horrific housing. By the way, novelists in France, Émile Zola or Balzac in Germany, dozens in America, all over. There's endless evidence about this. Marx drew the conclusion, the problem, the slogan, the hope of the French Revolution is as compelling and as beautiful as ever. But the idea that capitalism was the vehicle to do that has proven to be mistaken. And therefore, Marx, talking about himself, said, I therefore devoted my life to trying to understand why capitalism has been, and as he came to believe, would forever be, unable to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that if you want those things, you have to go beyond capitalism. Capitalism is not the agency that will bring it. Capitalism is the obstacle to its realization. So if you want to understand the passion, it's the passion of the love for the ideals of the French and American revolutions, wedded in Marx to the facing up to the fact that capitalism hadn't been able to deliver what it was promised would be part of its benefits. And I must say, if someone asks me today, why are you a Marxist? My answer would be ditto. That I would look at the 150 years since Marx died, that capitalism has been around, and his conclusion that it failed to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity, then all I can say is good understanding, because it hasn't been able to deliver it now either. The gap between rich and poor in the world today is greater, perhaps, than it has ever been. Whole continents, for example, Africa, sit in a condition that is unspeakable. The gap here in the United States between the rich and the poor, and I don't just mean in their wealth and their income, but their access to culture, their access to education, their access to school, medical care, it's grotesque. We have not produced liberty, equality, and fraternity. Nothing close to it.